I want to admit a deficiency in my pastoral ministry. I sometimes have difficulty talking about money in the church. And that is because I'm sensitive because money has often been abused in the church. You've heard of pastors that, pocket the offering, or televangelists, or those who have abused what has been given. And so I'm always a little bit sort of tiptoe around talking about money in the church. I just don't want it to seem self-serving or be misinterpreted, and so sometimes I'm sensitive. The negative of that is that I wonder sometimes if, as a pastor, I haven't done the best job of teaching kids and youth about giving. So that children's message right there, okay, the Bible talks about money, so I need to talk about it with our kids. We need to talk about it with our kids. And so I wonder sometimes if I haven't done the best job of that as a pastor. Given younger generations, even now young adults, a compelling reason to give to the church, to give offering, because I've just sort of avoided it or talked very little about it. Older generations, those of you, you can decide if you're an older generation or not. It's up to you. But there are generations that I'm amazed. There a certain generation, you were just taught this is what you do. And it's a reflex. You don't even think about it. So there are generations in our church that just tithe. They're just like, that's what we do. That's what my parents taught me. That's what I learned in church, just 10%. There are people in our church that give up to half of their income every year as an offering to church. They just do it. There's a seasoned giver in our church who told me once, you can't outgive the Lord. And so her giving is just a reflection of that. There are people in our church who will forego a vacation because they're like, we could, but we're not going to because we're going to give that away. There are people in our church that drive a car a couple more years instead of getting a new car because they're like, I don't need that car, and this allows me some margin to be more generous. I mean, that's just certain segments, certain generations of our church. But sometimes, especially younger generations, I don't know if we've made the case or taught well why we give offering. So today, I'm going to give you 4 reasons why you give to the church. Before I do that, 2 words of preface. The first one is this. I'm talking specifically today about money. Some people say, well, I give my time, Pastor, or I give my skills. And that's great. Be generous with your time. Be generous with any skills that you have. That's great. Do that. But sometimes that can be a cop-out for giving money. Because you say, well, I don't give money to the church, but I give my time. Well, we're going to talk about money today for 2 reasons. 1, the Bible talks about it. And 2, sometimes that can be a cop-out. Money hits the heart. And if you think, I'm just going to give my time because actually I sort of want to hold on to this over here, we actually need to talk about money because it's going to strike you in the heart, and that needs to happen. So today, I'm just going to walk right into it. We're going to talk about money and the church. Second word of preface today. Second word of preface. I recognize there are various stages and seasons represented here. We have kids, we have youth, young adults, people with a lot of debt. We have people on a fixed income. So I'm not talking about amount. I'm just talking about the basic principles, not the amount. Some of you who are younger, you might say, I'll give when I hit this mark. I'll give when I have enough. I'll give when I've paid off my student debt. If you say, I'm going to give when, you'll never give now. If you don't give when you have little, you won't know what it is to give when you have a lot. And so it's not a matter of when, it's just now, something. That's just it's a spiritual discipline, it's a reflex of the heart, even right now, regardless of if you have debt, if you have very little. The widow's mite, it's a reflex of giving to God. All right, so today, 4 reasons money in the church. This is going to go over like a lead balloon. I'm watching you and you're like, oh boy, pastor's coming for me. Well, maybe. First reason, to give to the church. Giving is tied to your heart. You've heard this verse before. Jesus said, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. An offering is first and foremost an issue of the heart. It's not about church bills. It's not about a duty or obligation. First and foremost, it's about your heart. Your pastors care about your heart. And you hear us say this often. We don't want something from you. We want something for you. And we want your heart shaped after God. And giving up of treasure is actually a way in which God shapes our heart. And we care about your heart. Different nonprofits, different organizations, they may want support, and that's fine. We don't want support. We want your heart. We want what's best for your heart. Sacrificial giving is an act of worship, we always say. It acknowledges where our resources come from. You've heard in the Bible about first fruits giving. So an example of Proverbs 3:9. Why don't you read this with me? Honor the Lord with your wealth and with the first fruits of all your produce. You may know about first fruits. That's an important word. First fruits means that in the Old Testament, they would give an offering from the first fruits of the land, the first of the crop, harvest it, and before they got any further down the road, before you got to the second or third crop, they would take from that first crop and bring it to the priest as an offering to God. Now, first fruits is really important because, think about this, if you take the first crop off the land and you bring it to God, you don't know if there's going to be a second crop or a third. There could be a drought, flood, there could be pests. You don't know what's going to happen next. So to bring a first fruit is really an act of faith. The reverse would be to say, hey, I'm going to make sure my barns, my silos are full, and then at the end of the season, I'm going to give God whatever's left. That would be like last fruits, I guess. If there's first fruits, that would be last fruits. This says, first fruits says, I'm going to give, I don't know what tomorrow's, I don't know if my paycheck's going to come through next month, but I'm going to give now, and it's an act of trust to say, God, I know you're going to show up next month and next year. This is an act, I trust you, so I'm going to give you first, not second, not leftovers. It's a first fruit. It's tied to the heart. It's an act of faith, a way in which God shapes and forms our heart. God doesn't need donations. God doesn't want you to treat him like a server at a restaurant where you just give a tip. Don't tip God. He wants your first and your best, not sort of the after or the leftovers. And that's an issue of the heart. He wants your heart. So first, why we give to the church, giving is tied to your heart. And giving is best learned by doing it, not just talking about it. This sermon will be like, you'll think whatever. But if you actually do it, that's how you best learn how to give, just by doing it. And it shapes your heart. Second reason why we give in the church, giving is an antidote to greed. Our sinful souls regress to greed and gain. We're naturally turned in on self. All of us, your pastors too. There's just this inclination to take care of self first. And so to give money is hard. It can be even painful. But yet this is precisely the spiritual surgery that's necessary to root out the grip of greed. The first commandment says you will have no other gods, and we're tempted by the god of currency and control. And so we need giving as actually a pushback on that inclination in our hearts. My wife sometimes says that I'm cheap. I prefer frugal. It's okay to be frugal. It's okay to be prudent. But there's a fine line between being frugal and being stingy. Stingy is a liability. Stinginess actually degrades you. Stingy says, if I give this, then I won't have enough. And that's a lack of faith. Stinginess is a lack of faith. On the flip side, generosity, a generous heart says, I can give this and I know that I'll be okay tomorrow. I trust God for daily bread. Daily bread, each and every day, not monthly bread, yearly bread, not retirement bread. I don't know what will happen next year or in retirement, but I'm going to trust Him daily. Like manna every morning, it shows up. What happened when the Israelites started to kind of hoard the bread? It rotted. Stinginess will rot you. It just will. There's a great line from George MacDonald. George MacDonald is credited to kind of be C.S. Lewis's inspiration. C.S. Lewis was influenced by George MacDonald. He says, "Is it not time that I lost a few things when I care for them so unreasonably? The losing of things is the mercy of God. It comes to teach us to let them go." Sometimes we need to lose a few things. Things that we've gripped so tightly, whether it's a money or a possession or the security that a certain amount in your bank account gives you. As long as I have this much, then I'll be okay. And maybe you need to lose that because you care for it unreasonably. Next, giving is an investment in ministry. So, as an act of faith and worship, what your money actually does in the church is really of no consequence when you're talking just about relationship with God. We could, as a church, receive all of your money and just get rid of it, and it would still fulfill the purpose of being an offering to God. So, we could take all the checks and the cash and burn it. We could take all of the electronic giving and just push delete. I don't know if you can do that, but imagine all of your Bitcoin and everything, you just go delete. We could do that, and it would still be an offering to God. Let me just be really clear. We don't do that, okay? We employ all the resources given by God's people, and we take it very seriously, the shrewd financial management of our church. As a rule, you support what you value. St. Paul, his letter to the Philippians, is largely a thank you letter to the church in Philippi to say thank you for your partnership in the gospel. Thank you for your contribution that helped make the gospel go out further. And the New Testament is filled with this. Paul talks often about the churches supporting one another, giving to one another. It's a partnership in the gospel. That's what your offering is too in your church. It's a partnership in the gospel. It's an investment in ministry. And as a rule, you support what you value. So do you value what we're doing here together? Your offering demonstrates that your church matters. It says, I'm in, I'm participating. And as I mentioned to the kids, it does all kinds of stuff. Buildings and facilities and technology and ministry staff and missionaries and the needs of our community and kids and education and on down the line. It does stuff. It's a partnership in the gospel. God uses you, and your giving has an impact. You may know that we've launched a new church, Christ Memorial Makana Jesus, our Ethiopian congregation. This really developed at the end of our budget planning cycle in May, so we did not make provision for this new ministry financially. We didn't make provision for it. It was already too late in our budget cycle. The budget had been passed. And so we walked in and we're saying, well, I think we just need to do this. It's not expensive, but there are some just basic costs that we had to figure out. And one day, there was like a donation given to our church, and it was anonymous. It just showed up. $7,500 just showed up. And we're like, well, that's a partnership in the gospel. That bought a new keyboard for worship in that worship service. That paid for the launch a couple weeks ago for food and for some guests who came in, a guest preacher who came in. And that will provide for some needs for the rest of the fiscal year. It's not a lot of money, but it was just at the right time, a partnership in the gospel. Giving is an investment in ministry. So giving is tied to your heart. It's an antidote to greed. It's an investment in ministry. Finally, giving makes us distinct as Christians. If you'd read Acts 2:45 with me. And they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. Sacrificial giving was a mark of the early Christians. It was radical, and it distinguished them. It was just different. All over the New Testament, we see the church providing for one another, selling their stuff. When there was a famine in Jerusalem, the church in Antioch collected all kinds of funds and sent it to meet that need. And so we see all over the place that Christians are giving their money away, supporting one another. This is distinct from donating to charities. There's a line that the world donates, Christians give sacrificially. A donation doesn't pinch enough. A donation's too easy. Sacrificial giving, that's where you get to the heart. Am I willing to sacrifice, to give something of significance where it even pinches a bit? Tim Keller, the late Tim Keller, pastor in Redeemer Presbyterian in New York City, he writes about this historical perspective on giving in the church. Maybe a little bit small, but if you can see it, I'll read it. Keller writes, the early church was strikingly different from the culture around it in this way. The pagan society was stingy with its money and promiscuous with its body. A pagan gave nobody their money and practically gave everybody their body. And the Christians came along and gave practically nobody their body, and they gave practically everybody their money. This distinguished the early Christians from anybody else. How you treat your money, how you treat your body will stand out from the world around you. And when it comes to finances, when you are generous, when people see you as hospitable and generous and giving, they'll pay attention and notice that something is different because the norm is stinginess. The economy was a major issue in this last election. It may have been a deciding factor in the election on a number of fronts. So top of mind for everybody, and maybe you too, is the economy. Jobs, interest rates, affordability, inflation, stock market. The economy is good. It's not a bad thing. But be careful when we make economy an idol. Sometimes we look to money for God-like things. We look to money and we say, well, if I just had that, then I would have choices. If I just had enough money, I would have power. If I just had enough money, then I'd really be happy. If I just had enough money, then I would really be secure. All of those things are God-like things. And if you look to money for God-like things, you will be disappointed. So be careful in placing God-like expectations on money. It's important, I'm not saying it's unimportant, but it's not God. The economy was an important issue, and it is among us, but just be careful. In his earthly ministry, Jesus did not obsess about money, power, comfort. His only obsession was a rescue mission for you. Jesus of Nazareth did not leave behind an estate for his followers to have. He did not leave behind any money. He had no real estate. He had no investment portfolio. He didn't say, hey, I've built this up and I'm going to give it to my friends and followers and family. He had nothing to give them, and yet he gave them everything. In Jesus was everything: real truth, real life, and life eternal. The real things that matter and that outlast. Everything else is a mirage. And Jesus gave that all. We read in the epistle lesson earlier today from 2 Corinthians. If you'd read this with me. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that by his poverty might become rich. He left everything, gave everything, became poor. That's a revelation of the heart. When somebody gives sacrificially, and your Lord has done that, his poverty so that you might become rich. And so as Christians, our eyes are fixated on this Lord, giving and generous. And we go the way of our Lord, generous, giving, and sacrificial. Amen.